So I just recently submitted a paper to a journal, and this was a mainstream journal in the sense that they wouldn't normally publish something about psychic phenomena. And very predictably, one of the referees said, "You're not providing a mechanism for this, so there's no theory underneath it, and the journals that you're citing where it is reporting evidence, those are not credible journals." So it's very similar kinds of reactions again and again. And underneath it all is, this violates everything we know about science. So if this was true, we would have to throw all our textbooks away and start over again. Well, sorry, but we're constantly revising textbooks. We've been doing that from the very beginning. Every 2 years you have a new edition. Why do we have that? Because science is an open process. It's not about dogma. It's not about accepting a theory and sticking with it, but to constantly be changing as new observations and new ideas come along. If we don't do that, then it's not science, then it's theology. Physics is all about understanding the nature of the physical world. So in many ways, classical physics, now called classical physics, is a refinement of common sense, kind of. It puts it into mathematics, and we have equations, and we have ways of making predictions about things of the everyday world. So as physics has advanced, it started looking at the macroscopic world, the world of space and very large objects and gravity and speed of light and things like that. And it also went in the other direction to look at the microscopic world. So the two things of surprise then was the everyday world of classical physics works really well. We were able to go to the moon using classical physics. But when you start dealing with very large objects like planets and large amounts of gravity and things of that sort, it doesn't work so well anymore. So Einstein developed relativity, general and special relativity, which is useful for understanding what happens when you get out of the everyday world into the macroscopic space. But this also includes things like speed of light. Quantum physics was developed because when you start going into the microscopic world, things don't look classical either, and nor do they look relativistic. So it's a description of what we can think of as the deep world, the world made up of subatomic particles. We now know that it actually applies to much more than that. It also applies to the macroscopic world, but that's where it started. And that's where, if we were able to shrink down to the size of an atom, we would experience a very, very different kind of reality. So the quantum physics is saying that at the microscopic scale, there are three elements of the classical world which no longer exist. So the three elements of the classical world are reality, causality, and locality. Those three elements. So locality is talking about in the everyday world, in order to get something to happen, you need to be local to it. So the idea is like a billiard ball table, where to get one ball to do something, you have to hit it with another ball. It has to be contact in some way. So that's locality. Causality is the notion that you can understand why something is happening because you can create a mechanistic linkage between one thing and another. This ball hits that ball, and that ball hits this ball, and it's a linkage of causal reasons, cause and effect. We say that all the time, and it's a very effective way of understanding the everyday world. That doesn't exist in the quantum world. Nor does causality exist in the quantum world in the same way it does in the everyday world. And then the third, which is the most important, is reality. So reality in the classical sense is that if I'm going to observe a system, like a physical system, a rock or a tree or something, the fact that I'm observing it makes no difference. Like I'm independent of that thing. That's not true in the quantum world either. So reality, causality, and locality, all three of those are put into question in quantum mechanics. So you go down into this microscopic realm, well, locality doesn't work very much anymore. We know that there is non-locality. Things can be separated at far distances and still be connected in some way. We don't see that in the everyday world. So locality was questioned very early on in the 1930s in quantum mechanics, because the prediction was that a description of a quantum system involves wave-like characteristics. And so if two things interact, what you end up with is a more complicated wave. But the wave extends throughout space and time. So that would suggest, and Einstein didn't like this, that's why he came up with the notion of spooky action at a distance. Two things interact, they now become a more complicated wave-like structure, but they're connected. Even though they've gone onto their separate directions in space and time, they're still connected through this wave-like structure, which would predict that if you poke one of them, the other one would respond. Now that's said in a very simplistic way, and the physicists would start arguing with the way I just said it. But in a popular way, that's more or less what's happening, that the properties of this and the properties of that are still connected, even though they appear to be separate. So again, we don't see that in the everyday world, except for one area. So when two people are separate, two separate people go on their ways, maybe they're identical twins, maybe not, and one of them has an accident and the other one feels the pain, even though they're very separate from each other, we call that a telepathic connection. So even Einstein was saying that this idea of entanglement, that things are separate in space and time, and yet they're still connected in some way, it's like telepathy. Well, so we have telepathy in the everyday world, and that's why there's at least a correlation then. There's something in the everyday world and at this quantum level which looks similar. So it raises the possibility that maybe quantum mechanics is a more elementary form of what people describe in various terms as psychic phenomena. The part of this which is maybe the most disturbing is that reality is also put into question. So again, in the classical sense, reality is that I'm looking at this plant, and the fact that I'm looking at it makes no difference. It doesn't change its behavior as a result and that's usually how it works here, unless you're looking at a sentient creature and they're responding to your looking and so on. In the quantum world, that's no longer the case. The way that you look at a quantum object, let's say, quantum particle, it changes its behavior. So this is called the quantum measurement problem. It's related to the quantum reality notion, that we don't know why it is that what you know about a quantum object makes its behavior different. It's an unsolved problem. And there are many proposals that have been given to maybe explain how this works, but the fact is we don't know yet how to solve this problem. This provides an opening then for various kinds of psychic effects, primarily mind-matter interaction effects, because it raises the possibility that something about the nature of observation, especially from a sentient creature, is interacting with the matter itself. So mind and matter are interacting, or fundamentally connected. And what's interesting then is you look at a number of famous physicists over the years who took this very seriously. People like Max Planck, who started the idea of the quantum, and John von Neumann, and later people like John Wheeler, and many others who are giving names that didn't sound all that spooky. They were talking about psychophysical interactions, or talking about a participatory universe, those kinds of words. Those in a different context would be called psychokinetic effects, which is a term used in parapsychology. But of course, a physicist would never want to be associated with parapsychology because it sounds too spooky, just as Einstein didn't. But nevertheless, there is a relationship there. So a neuroscientist would say mind and matter are clearly, or at least mind and the brain are clearly related because of the neural correlates of consciousness. I think certain things and the brain is doing certain things. From a neuroscience perspective, we would say then that the brain is causing those experiences. That's an inference. Causation, the direction of causation is always an inference, unless we have really strong evidence that it's one direction or otherwise. So we don't know that the neural correlates are actually brain causing mind. It could be the other way around. It could be that mind, whatever that is somehow manipulating the brain in such a way so that it is reflecting. It's like a mirror reflection of what's going on. So these are unresolved questions. The strength of the opinion that somebody has can be predicted based on what discipline they come from. So if you ask a conventional neuroscientist, they will tell you in great gory detail why it is the brain that's causing this. If you ask a philosopher who specializes in ideas like idealism, which assumes that everything comes out of consciousness, they will argue just as strenuously in the other direction. If you ask somebody doing psi research, like myself, I will say, I don't know, but it looks like the correlation actually goes in both directions. That there are some aspects of brain which give rise to aspects of mind, and the other way around. The mind is not fully brain. It's something else, but it can manipulate the brain in various ways. So from my perspective, I would say I'm a little bit more open to the possibility of a two-way interaction rather than one definitely causing the causal direction in one way or the other. And so I'm always free to admit I don't know. My best guess is dual interaction in some way. What we do is we pay close attention to the experiences that people have. That's the starting point for the experiments that we run. So to take telepathy as an example, you have two people who are far distant from each other, and one bumps their knee and the other one starts complaining that their knee hurts. So that would be sometimes called a telesomatic experience. It wasn't that they shared cognition, but they felt something in their body at the same time, as best as we can tell. And there are many stories like that. And then there are other stories where people who are separate from each other start thinking the same things. And we know that in the modern world through things like telephone telepathy. So the phone rings and you instantly know who it is, and the other person has been thinking of you and they call you and that sort of thing. You want to see, was that simply a coincidence? Because there's billions of people and lots of things can just happen by coincidence. So you go into the laboratory and devise a design which is controlled for coincidence. So you know that if two people are separate in a telepathy experiment, you can calculate in advance what the probability is that something is going to be chance or not. So in the simplest possible way is something like the Ganzfeld telepathy experiment, in which you separate people. One is presented with a random image or video, and the other one has to describe that. Well, you know that depending on how you set up the experiment, there might be 4 possible videos they could get, and so this person could describe one by chance 25% of the time. So if you do this kind of experiment many, many times, and you find out that they're not getting it 25% of the time, but they're getting it 30% of the time, well, where did the additional information come from? Given that you've controlled everything, so they're not guessing, you can say, well, by coincidence, they're getting 5% more than they should. And if you run this many, many times, you can develop a probabilistic estimate of how likely would that happen purely by chance. So we're at the stage now, after running this something like 4,000 sessions in many labs around the world, the probability in the vernacular is a gazillion to 1, billions upon billions to 1 against chance. So yes, some things will happen by chance, not at the tune of multiple billions to 1. That's not likely to happen. Precognition, the word means cognizing the future, precognizing, so pre-knowing the future, which implies consciously knowing, being aware of what's happening. Presentiment is a term that I borrowed from other contexts, which says pre-feeling. Sentiment means feeling. So pre-feeling means that you don't have any cognition or knowing about what's happening, but it is reflected in your body, the way your body is responding. So there's a number of ways that could happen. One is that your nervous system can respond, and we can measure that. Another is that you're doing something that involves a reaction time or a decision made in the present. Well, it's not because you know what's going to happen, but you feel different and so you respond differently in some way. So those I would call into a category of presentiment as compared to precognition. This was a study about energy medicine, sometimes also called spiritual healing, psychic healing, Reiki, Joe Ray, therapeutic touch, all of those kinds of methods which have something to do with the mind and intention, although not always, and something to do with feeling some sort of biofield around somebody else, but not always. A very wide range of methods that are used. The idea in all cases is that the client or the client presents a problem, typically some sort of pain. And the practitioner then does something and the pain goes away. So we're interested in this from a number of different directions. And we wanted to see that for a uniform group of people, each of whom having hand or wrist pain, generally considered carpal tunnel pain, that if you got a healer to spend 30 minutes doing whatever it is that they do, would the pain be helped? So there are many measures involved here. One measure was simply a subjective measure about pain. It's a classic way of, from a scale of 0 to 10, how much is your pain? So would that scale change after 30 minutes? The answer there was yes, very significant change in the direction of less pain. And we had 3-week follow-up, and the pain was still less after 3 weeks. So something happened, so they did something. We had ended up with, I think, 19 different healers using different kinds of methods and 190 clients, patients who came in to do this. In each case, a total of 30 minutes of healing. We had a box with a whole bunch of these generators in it, in the room where the healing was taking place. And we were able to get continual measures, so we saw how was this operating before the healing, during a 30-minute healing, and then afterwards. And then as a control, what was happening in the box when no one was there 8 hours later, in the middle of the morning. So what we found was a significant decrease in entropy, or flip it, an increase in negentropy, an increase in order as measured by these devices during the 30-minute period when the healing was taking place, not before, not afterwards, and not 8 hours later at all. So this also was a replication of many previous experiments, which suggests that something about focused attention seems to, in the environment, seems to create negentropic periods. Everything is becoming more orderly. The magnitude of these effects, like all of the experiments we do, tends to be really tiny. So it takes a lot of data in order to see it, but once you're able to see it, statistically speaking, it is there. There's a real difference. And we always have a control to compare to make sure that the analysis and the equipment and everything are okay. So something happened. It happened in the direction of something about consciousness or intention, changed something in the environment, correlated with a person feeling reduced pain in their wrist. In the initial stages, you want to know, is the patient better? Like, it doesn't matter what's going on. All that really matters is the patient gets better. Well, maybe it's a placebo effect. So we asked people beforehand, do you think this is going to work? Well, most people didn't have any idea if it was going to work. So there was no strong placebo. Some people thought it would. Other people thought it wouldn't. Other people had no opinion. It still worked. And there wasn't any correlation between the degree to which it worked and the degree of belief. So it didn't look like a placebo effect. More importantly, there were objective measures that basically none of the patients even knew that were there. And they didn't know anything about the random number generators or other measures that we had in the same room. So looks like whatever the healers were doing, it did something. Changed the room somehow a little bit. Because we've seen in laboratory context, if you take one person, you take a random number generator, and you ask that person to change something about the behavior of the random number generator by thinking about it, and the random number generator would provide some sort of graph showing how it's doing. So like many of our experiments, you're getting feedback as to what's happening. You have periods where you're trying to make a change and periods where you're not trying to make a change. 50 years of research and several meta-analyses show that that does something. The behavior is changing. The next question that came about was, in almost all of those experiments, most of them, involved intention. We give you instructions to intend that this thing happens. So after many years, then people started thinking, well, maybe if you have intention, you also must have attention. You can't have one without, you could have attention without intention, but not the other way around. So then the question was, well, maybe you don't really need intention at all. All you need is attention. So experiments began where you would take a random number generator and you'd put it in the vicinity of a group that was doing very high attentional work, like a group of meditation or a choral group that was singing or people in a movie theater. Attention is being modulated in those contexts, sometimes very tightly and sometimes less. So you put the random generator in the vicinity, you record it continually, and you have a way of measuring this was a period of very high attention and this is a period of low intention. And then you look at the data afterwards, and again, what we would see is that during periods of high attention, there was more order. There was more pattern and order going on in the random generator. It was less random as compared to when there was low attention. So we got the idea, well, wouldn't it be interesting, given the way that modern media works, that if you have billions of people paying attention to the same thing at the same time, well, maybe we would see a change in randomness. So I started doing experiments, and my colleagues were doing experiments where big things were happening on TV, like the opening ceremony of the Olympics and the pronouncement of the result of a big murder trial and things like that, where we knew there were millions to hundreds of millions of people all watching simultaneously for this event. We saw results there. We saw changes in randomness as a result. So this looks then like a mind-matter interaction at the global scale. Then we thought, well, we can do this whenever there's a planned event, but what about unplanned events that gain a huge amount of attention, like a terrorist activity? All the media in the world will suddenly focus on that. So we started this thing called the Global Consciousness Project. Actually, it was the baby of Roger Nelson, who was a psychologist at Princeton University, who got the idea of putting it on the internet. So we'd have random number generators in major cities around the world running 24/7, continually. All of the data then sent up to a server at Princeton, and then we could look at what's happening to worldwide randomness. The formal part of the experiment was 500 events. Some were positive, some were negative. The way that the experiment would work is, since we're getting data continually, we have lots and lots of control data where things like no big events are happening. When something either was planned, like it's New Year's, or a terrorist attack that was not planned, we would evaluate whether or not we thought enough people were paying attention at the same time, and then specify on this day for this length of time, this is the data we're going to look at. We do that first. Then we go to the data, we pull it out, and we use a standardized method of evaluating did the data deviate from chance or not. So after the 500 events, you can do a meta-analysis of what is the overall result. Well, it was a 7 sigma deviation from chance. That's associated with odds against chance of 3 trillion to 1. A huge effect. You can get the Nobel Prize for a 5 sigma effect, which is what happened for the Higgs boson. 5 sigma, Nobel Prize. This is 7 sigma, but doesn't have the theory underneath it as to why it works, which is why there's no Nobel Prize. But 7 sigma tells you something happened here in terms of overall randomness. The third method is to look at Google trends, Google search trends, because when something happens in the world, it's very predictable. You go into Google and people are searching for words having to do with those events. So we did a correlation between the results of the randomness versus trends in Google, showing how much people were paying attention. Again, a significant correlation. So does the preponderance of the data produced by thousands of people in tens of thousands of experiments over a century now, does it lead you to the conclusion that some psychic phenomena are real? The answer is yes. I would say overwhelmingly yes. As a scientist, I always keep a little bit of caution because it's very difficult. We're not proving anything in science. We're providing evidence that provides better and better confidence about your opinion of what's going on. One of the reasons why this is so difficult then I'm saying, yes, psychic phenomena are real, but there's a lot of things that can mimic psychic phenomena that are due to chance, that are due to fraud, that are due to memory lapses, all kinds of other things come into play. So the challenge then from a scientific perspective is how do you discriminate from things that are not psychic to things that are psychic? Well, over years, probably a dozen different classes of experiments have been devised that have been used and then criticized and fixed and criticized and fixed again and on and on and on. So now we have methods that can be applied to study things like mind-matter interaction and telepathy and clairvoyance and so on, that as best as we know have closed all the loopholes. And this is as usefully as a result of very harsh criticism over the years by people who said, no, this can't possibly be real. You made this mistake. You have to fix that. And so through many, many refinements of these methods, we've come to designs where the critics now can say they can't think of any plausible alternative explanation. That's as close to a loophole-free experiment that you can get. Those experiments show results too. So it gives us more and more confidence that things like telepathy and clairvoyance and precognition and some forms of mind-matter interaction actually do exist. They are real. Will the evidence for psychic phenomena get to the point where our worldview will change, the scientific worldview will change? I believe the answer is yes. Will it change in a radical way? It depends on whether or not these phenomena can be described in a materialistic fashion, which is possible. It may be possible because our notion of what we mean by material has radically changed over the last century. From classical physics to quantum and relativistic physics, our notion of what matter is and space and time have very radically changed. It has taken a long time for the rest of the world to catch up with the fact that our sense of reality is nothing, from a physics perspective, it really is nothing like our everyday experience. It's radically different. So we don't really care too much as a person walking around the street because all we really care about are pragmatics. We want to know, can we get a better method of healing? Can we have new devices, new games, things like that? So from a science perspective, though, you step away from it and look at all of the ways that science have advanced in many different disciplines. Holy smoke, it's very radically different than what was thought about 20 years and 40 years and a century ago. It's really different. Will it be different 20 to 40 years hence? Absolutely it will. Will some of that include psychic phenomena? I think it will. So from a materialistic perspective, maybe our notion of what we mean by space, time, matter, and energy will also change. And then we will think of it as material. It's still materialism. It's just a more refined form of materialism. Just like quantum mechanics in many ways is a refined form, a more comprehensive way of thinking about the nature of matter. So that could happen. We could go into some other realm of materialism that would not be considered material today, but nevertheless would be thought of in those terms. The other possibility is that we'll head more into a direction which is currently thought of as either energetic or informational or maybe even spiritual, that will become easier to deal with. And when you use those terms today, especially spiritual, it makes scientists' hair stand up. If I had hair, it would be standing up, because it sounds like it's too close to religion, and that's not what we do. Nevertheless, there's some aspects of what we call spiritual now that may eventually make its way into science, because we'll understand what people mean when they talk about those kinds of topics. If that happens, it will change the nature probably of what we currently think of as religion, too, because now some aspects of religion, namely the spiritual parts, will be understood in a scientific way. So some people who are today very religious like that idea because it's a confirmation of what they always felt. Others don't like that at all because they like the dogma, they like the pure explanations that are given by whatever religious text that they follow. And they don't want science intruding on that. I would say, well, too bad. Science marches on. We're beginning to expand more and more comprehensively the nature of what it means to be alive and the nature of the world and so on. Eventually, it will have to include consciousness. And more scientists today are recognizing that. We have to include consciousness because we all know. We know it. But it's not yet, we don't have a good explanation for it yet. So that's why there are more and more scientists going in that direction and thinking about how do we begin to understand this better? How do we test it? One of the reasons why I like parapsychology is because it's been 100 years ahead of the pack. We've known from the beginning that there's something peculiar about consciousness, about our subjective experience, that doesn't seem to fit with our way of understanding the physical world. Eventually, we will better understand it, and that will change everything. I don't know exactly what it would mean for all of us to be interconnected. From a physical sense, you can make a claim that at a quantum mechanical scale, entanglement covers everything, so we're interconnected that way. From the psychic side, people have experiences where their minds are not just in there. They're somewhere out there too, including with other people's minds. So there's kind of an interconnection there too. So there's no one explanation here. It's that there's somehow we're living in a holistic medium in which sometimes matter and sometimes mind are coexisting in some way.